Welcome to Cabeza de Vaca. Episode 24, The Ideal Conquest. I'm Brandon Seale. From the minute that Álvar Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca, Alonso Castillo, Andrés Dorantes, and Esteban, the black Arab from Zamora, had walked into that Castilian slavers' camp in April of 1536, it was clear that there was no way they were ever really going to go back to the Native American world. Yet these four expeditionaries hadn't yet fully re-entered the Castilian world either, and this started to really bother the slavers. First off, the expeditionaries refused to put any clothes on. It would be months, in fact, before they could even tolerate the feel of clothes on their skin again. Second, it also took them a few weeks before they could even fall asleep on a bed, preferring to just curl up on the hard ground like a dog. Third, they still insisted on carrying around their ridiculous so-called insignia of authority, which to the slavers just looked like a couple of dried-out gourds. Fourth, and this starts to get to the real issue, it unsettled the slavers to see the way that the natives followed around and hung on every word of their four children of the sun, as they referred to the expeditionaries. And fifth, and worst of all, the expeditionaries had made no attempt to hide their opposition to the slavers' business, and in fact they'd actively prevented them from rounding up the 600 natives who had generously brought the slavers food at the expeditionaries' request. And so the slavers decided that they needed to get rid of these four guys. As soon as they could, they sent them south, under armed escort. The four expeditionaries quickly realized that the slavers' guard wasn't there so much for their protection as it was to keep them in line, and it was a bit of a painful realization. Quote, "We went to them in search of liberty, and when we thought we had it, it turned out that it was the opposite," end quote. No, instead, they'd been placed on a death march to Culiacan via the most circuitous, difficult path possible, meant to keep them out of contact with their old followers, and well, if it killed them off along the way, maybe that was for the better. 7 men in the party escorting them to Culiacan actually did die on the road, but the expeditionaries by this point were pretty well hardened to any kind of hardship, and they made it alive and well. The experience, however, led them to fear that as soon as they had been marched out of the slavers' camp, that the slavers had immediately gone back on their word and went out and captured their native followers. Yet the first man that they met in Culiacan, the leader, in fact, of the Castilian civil administration there, was a very different kind of man than the slavers whose company the expeditionaries had just departed. Melchor Diaz, the alcalde mayor here in Culiacan, seemed genuinely appalled at how the four old expeditionaries had been treated by the slavers, and actually rode out to accompany them on the last few miles into Culiacan. As he rode with them and listened to them tell their story, quote, "He cried with us, thanking our Lord God for having shown so much mercy to us," end quote. First, Diaz's tears and prayers are Cabeza de Vaca's way of telling us that he's a good guy, cut from the same cloth as himself, and it gave them reason to hope that there were others like him within the Castilian world they had so long sought to be reunited with. And second, Diaz's weeping for the plight of the expeditionaries can't help but recall the weeping of the Caboque Indians back on Galveston Island, where the quote-unquote captivity of Cabeza de Vaca and his companions had begun, making this just another nice little bookend that Cabeza de Vaca drops into his narrative to signal this as the end of his journey. The expeditionaries took advantage of Alcalde Diaz's sympathetic ear to describe for him what they had seen up the coast: abandoned fields, depopulated villages, native populations starving themselves rather than be taken captive by the Castilian slavers. Diaz, in turn, shared that the slavers' activity had placed him in a difficult situation as well. Namely, it had left both Castilians and natives in his province starving. The natives, recall, had all fled up into the mountains, which meant that they weren't raising corn, which meant that they weren't paying tribute, which meant that the system of imperial government wasn't working. Diaz begged the four expeditionaries to help him, to, quote, "send emissaries to call in the natives and tell them in the name of God and of your majesty to come down and resettle in the plains and work their lands," end quote. I think it's interesting that in a sense, Alcalde Diaz, a Castilian, is now asking the expeditionaries to prove themselves as medicine men. Just at the moment when Cabeza de Vaca and his companions thought that they were done with all that they had returned to the comfort and familiarity of their own culture, they're suddenly called upon again to perform yet another cure. Specifically, the, quote, grand service to God, end quote, that Alcalde Diaz was requesting from them was that the expeditionaries should call down from the mountains all the Indians in the area of Culiacan and convince them that if they would return to their fields and accept the sovereignty of the Castilian crown, that they might live in peace, even though everything that the expeditionaries had witnessed in their brief return to Castilian society suggested to them that this wasn't true, no matter how well-intentioned Alcalde Diaz may have been. But just as before, back in native North America, when the expeditionaries found that they had to perform their cures to keep the natives moving them through the countryside, they knew now that they needed Alcalde Diaz's help to move them along the rest of the way back home, and so that they were going to have to try and help him. But they also came to believe that they could change things, that their experience had taught them how to deal with the natives, and that from that experience, they might be able to teach their own countrymen how to deal with them as well. And so the 4 expeditionaries agreed to help the alcalde, because by doing so, they hoped they could demonstrate to Castilian administrators the rationality of the natives, and indeed the need to treat them kindly in order to win them over. To this end, they sent the last of their ceremonial gourds, quote, our principal insignia and proof of our great status, end quote, up into the mountains with 2 Indians who had seen them come into the slavers' camp a few weeks ago with their 600-man entourage. Then, for 7 days, those 2 natives dutifully canvassed the land, vouching for the works of these 4 old expeditionaries and spreading the news of their arrival in Culiacan. And sure enough, a week after they had put out the word, the 4 expeditionaries were pleased to see 3 great native lords and dozens of their followers come marching into Culiacan. It was approximately May 1st, 1536, exactly 8 years after Pánfilo de Narváez had called his ill-fated council on the Florida shore to decide whether to abandon his ships and march overland into North America. And here again, now in Culiacan, was convened a great council on the opposite side of the continent to symbolically close out the Narváez expedition. Yet the 4 surviving expeditionaries had prepared a very different speech than the one that Narváez had delivered back in Florida. And once the natives and Castilians, or Christians as they call them, had all been gathered together, they began. Quote, we told the Indians gathered there that we came on behalf of God who is in the sky, and that we had wandered through the world for 9 years, telling all we found that they should believe in God, and they should serve him, because he had authority over all things in the world, and he rewarded the good and repaid the bad with perpetual fire, and that when the good died, they were taken to the sky where no one dies, and where no one is hungry or thirsty or lacking for anything. But instead it was the greatest glory that anyone could imagine, and that those who did not want to believe in him or obey his commandments, he would cast beneath the earth in the company of demons in the midst of a great fire which never burns out, but which instead would torment them forever. In the alternative, if they wanted to be Christians and to serve God our Lord in the manner that we instructed, we told them that the Christians would hold them close as brothers and treat them well, and that we would order the Christians not to do them any harm or to remove them from their lands and to be their greatest friends. If they didn't wish to do this, however, the Christians would treat them very poorly, and they would carry them off as slaves to other lands. To this, the natives responded that they would be very good Christians and serve God. And when they were asked what they worshipped and sacrificed to, and to whom they prayed for rain for the corn and health for themselves, they responded that it was also a man who was in the sky. We asked them what his name was, and they said, Álvar, and that they believed he had created the world and all things in it. We asked them how they knew this, and they responded that their fathers and grandfathers had told them, that these things had been known for a long time, and they knew that water and all good things came from him. And we said that that being that they were talking about, that was who we called God, and that's what they should call him too, and that they should serve and worship him as we instructed, and things would turn out well for them. End quote. There is so much here. Okay, first, the expeditionaries, and I keep saying expeditionaries because all of the accounts just refer to the speakers here as collective. The expeditionary's speech begins with a little mini requerimiento, that statement of Castilian conquest that Narvaez had read upon disembarking in Florida 8 years before. Only in contrast to Narvaez's version, the expeditionaries are performing it in plain speech, in a way that a human being might actually be able to understand. And more even, they're doing it in the natives' tongue. It's as if their experience over the previous 8 to 9 years had taught them how to better present the mission of Castilian imperialism in a way that the natives might legitimately be able to consider and accept, while still complying with the requirements of Castilian law. Because I also think there's some bureaucratic ass-covering going on here by the expeditionaries. Even though Cabeza de Vaca frames this speech as the message that he and his companions have been sharing, quote, with everyone throughout the world, end quote, in actuality, this is the first time we've heard them get anything close to this doctrinal in their conversation with the natives. But if they're going to re-enter Castilian society, and if they're going to be taken seriously by Castilian authorities, they need to show that they respect the formalities of Castilian administration, and frankly, that they haven't forgotten their obligations under their mandato real. And so that's why they make a point at the outset of their speech here to rehash this requerimiento, because it establishes their bona fides in front of Castilian audiences, but they make sure to tailor it just enough to also make them credible to their native listeners. And it worked. The expeditionaries very quickly get the answer that they were supposed to get from the natives. Yes, the natives say, we'll be good Christians and become your friends. But then, without stopping or letting the Castilian administrators present settle for that answer, the expeditionaries keep the dialogue going and roll into a totally unexpected line of questioning. They take the incredible step of asking the natives about their faith, quote, what they worshipped and sacrificed to, and to whom they prayed for rain for the corn and health for themselves, end quote. They're showing the Castilian authorities that the natives are thoughtful, spiritual beings, and they're teaching their countrymen how to proselytize to them, not just by making demands on them, but by treating them as fully formed human beings with belief systems worth understanding. As we heard, the natives responded in turn that they worshipped a, quote, man who was in el cielo, end quote, in the sky or in heaven. Quote, we asked them what his name was, and they said, Álvar, and that they believed he had created the world and all things in it, end quote. Boom! With that, the expeditionaries have basically established in front of the Castilian authorities that these natives are proto-Christians. And the law is very clear that Castilians can't enslave Christianized Indians. But just to be sure, the expeditionaries then turn back to the natives and try to teach them how to get along with the Castilians. Quote, we said that being that the natives were talking about, that was who we called God, and that's what they should call him too, and that they should serve and worship him as we instructed, and things would turn out well for them, end quote. That thing you're already doing, the way you're already worshiping, the expeditionaries are saying, do more of that. And in fact, keep doing it the way you're doing it, but call him Dios, nuestro Señor. Things will go much smoother for you if you do. At a very basic, practical level, the expeditionaries here are teaching the natives how to answer the Castilians' questions in a way that rips away the slavers' veil of legitimacy. Because the only plausible way that the slavers can keep slaving is by contending that either the natives are not fully formed human beings, or that they didn't respond in the right way to the requerimiento, which previously had only been read to them in a language they couldn't understand. And so for the rest of this council here in Culiacan, the expeditionaries go on to give the natives more tips on how to protect themselves. Principally, they tell them to erect crosses throughout their lands and to carry crosses in front of them whenever they approach Castilians. It's interesting because never before have the expeditionaries placed any emphasis on Christian symbology, but suddenly, for very understandable reasons, it's at the top of their list. And after the council at Culiacan, the 3 native lords and all the other attendees peaceably returned to their people and brought them down from the highlands. Crosses began to appear throughout the countryside. Native-built churches began to pop up, and the children of the native lords were baptized as Christians. Soon, even the slavers whom the expeditionaries had first encountered up on the Rio Sinaloa came back into Culiacan and reported that there too, the natives were returning to their homes and beginning once again to work their fields, even coming out to the slavers with crosses and offering them food and gifts. So astonished was the captain of the slaving party that he ordered his men to return to Culiacan and to cause no more harm to the natives in the province. And for me at least, that's about as radical of a road to Damascus conversion as you could imagine. And that's why this scene, I believe, is the real climax of Cabeza de Vaca's story. It's the scene that justifies all the sufferings that he and his companions have endured and the faith that they have kept. By depicting Native Americans as capable of knowingly and willingly accepting the Castilians' God, Cabeza de Vaca and his companions are putting an end to any possible debate about the humanity of native populations and the rights that that entails. In the words of Cabeza de Vaca Uber scholars Rolena Adorno and Patrick Pautz, Cabeza de Vaca and his companions have just effected the, quote, ideal conquest, end quote. In contrast to Narvaez's attempted conquest by pronunciations, in contrast to the slavers' conquest by devastation, in contrast even to Cortez's conquest by arms, in this remote little corner on the Mexican frontier, 4 unarmed expeditionaries had just brought thousands of Native Americans into the service of the Castilian crown and to the knowledge of the Christian faith. And with that, Álvar Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca, Alonso Castillo, Andrés Dorantes, and Esteban have fulfilled the original mission assigned to them by the king 9 years after he'd given it to them. Quote, that in the king's name we should go and conquistar those lands, as well as bring the natives to knowledge of the true faith and true God and to service of your majesty, end quote. As a symbol of the success of their mission and the close of their ministry, the expeditionaries handed over their ceremonial gourds once and for all to the natives who had come down to listen to them. And Cabeza de Vaca then concludes his description of their stay in Culiacan with the prayer that, quote, may God our Lord, in his infinite mercy, will it that in all the days of your majesty's reign and under your power and lordship, these people shall come truly and freely as subjects of the true Lord that created and redeemed them. And we hold it for certain that it will be so, and that your majesty shall be the one to put it into effect. End quote. This story would be a lot happier if it ended here. But it doesn't. Cabeza de Vaca, Castillo, Dorantes, and Esteban left Culiacan a couple weeks later, sometime in the middle of May 1536. They arrived in modern-day Jalisco, near Guadalajara, in mid-June, and from there, their fame preceded them on the final month or so of their march into Mexico City. Because everyone, and I mean everyone, had known that the Pánfilo de Narváez expedition had perished in Florida to a man. And yet here they were, 4 miraculous survivors who had walked thousands of miles across the continent and showed up on the opposite coast with an entourage of hundreds of Native Americans following them. On July 23rd, 1536, the 4 expeditionaries entered Mexico City to great fanfare. The new viceroy, the archbishop, even the great old conquistador himself, Hernán Cortés, vied with each other to befriend the expeditionaries and, of course, to attach their particular agendas to their popularity. 100 years later, people would still be talking about the celebration held in their honor, replete with jousts, bullfights, and even a sort of reenactment of the expeditionaries' rescue from their quote-unquote captivity, with the expeditionaries playing themselves, dressed in deer hides and all. And yet, on the same day that he had entered Mexico City, Cabeza de Vaca tells us, marching just behind him and his companions in the same convoy, 500 new Indian slaves marched into the great capital. Why does Cabeza de Vaca include this detail for us at the moment of his triumphant return? It had seemed like he and his companions had delivered the death knell to Indian slavery back in Culiacan. Is something else going on here? Is there something that Cabeza de Vaca isn't telling us? On the next episode, on the last episode of Cabeza de Vaca. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to check out the webpage associated with this episode on therivardreport.com, home of nonprofit journalism for a better San Antonio. Editing for this episode was performed by Susana Canseco, sound engineering by Stephen Bennett. The music for this series is entitled Apache, and was composed by Kevin Graham and is available on Soundstripe. A special thanks to Father David Garcia, to Dr. Frank de la Teja with the Texas State Historical Association, to Steve Davis, curator of the Whitliff Collections at Texas State University, to Professor Andrés Resendez at the University of California, Davis, to Dr. Carolyn Boyd with the Shumla Archaeological Research and Education Center and also Texas State, and to David Dunham with Texas Monthly for all their support and suggestions. You'll hear more about them throughout the season. And for more information about us and our other projects, you can check out our website at www.brandonseale.com.